Well, thanks very much for asking me here. What I want to do is make trouble, okay? I'm fed up working with politicians who who get told all this kind of thing and then say, oh, I don't know how to do that. Oh, that would be very expensive. Oh, I'm not sure, and so on. And we've got to, as I'll describe, we've got to make communities rise up and take charge of what we need to do. Usually what I do is I talk about attachment. I talk about the importance of positive relationships between parents and children, allowing the children to grow up and so on. Today I'm going to talk about communities and how communities have helped create that sort of environment. So, health. I mean, for 15 years I was a surgeon, a lot of it on this campus here, and when it was the Western Infirmary. And basically, when I went to be a consultant at the Royal Infirmary, I used to operate on people living in these houses in Black Hill. And I always remember this old guy who came in. It was his third admission to a hospital with alcoholic pancreatitis. And I said to him, John, if you keep on drinking, the next time you come in here, you'll probably die. And apologies for the language here. He said, I know, I'm no effing stupid, he says. But my life is shite, and the booze is the only pleasure I've got in life, and therefore I'm going to keep on drinking. And I realised then that what they didn't need in these communities was surgery, what they needed was well-being. And I came back to this campus and went and did a Master's in Public Health. And, And that was the first time I came across this term salutogenesis. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being, and you had all these individuals, all these scientists coming up with ideas as to how you create well-being in communities. Things like giving people locus of control, coping, flourishing. I might come back to flourishing later if we've got time. Connectedness, cultural capital, learned optimism. These were really positive words that just weren't recognised out in those communities. And therefore, we had to try and work out how we went on and created a salutogenic environment in our communities. And you know, if you look at that, that's a picture of an area in Colorado. Does it make you feel good? Do you feel as if you might flourish in that environment? Probably not. Add in a shop. Does that help? A wee bit. You'd probably be able to go in and buy a gun in that shop, so it is Colorado after all. Add a few trees. Better still. You know, feels good. Somebody's taking care of that community by planting those trees and looking after them. And then you add that people, connectedness. So people being connected in a green space where there are facilities, suddenly you feel better about it all. And it's not those horrible tenements and so on that just leave folk looking for where the nearest pub is. So communities need to think about how they draw people together. So let's look at Scotland's health. This is a study we did a few years ago. It goes back to 1851, 170 years worth of life expectancy. The blue line is Scotland, and you can see that for most of that time, Scottish life expectancy was at the European average. It's only up here, for the 1950s, that it started to drift below the average. And if you look at the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population, they've done rather well. And this is the rate of growth in life expectancy in the poorest group of people. So it's the slow growth in life expectancy in poor people that has dragged Scotland's life expectancy down. Something happened in the 1950s that began to disintegrate communities. And it would be Shipyards would close, mines would close. You know, just generally speaking, the community began to fragment, and that didn't help the well-being of people. And, colleagues at Glasgow Centre for Population Health did an interesting study looking at income deprivation distribution across the population. This is Liverpool. They also looked at Manchester, which looked absolutely identical, and they looked at Glasgow. And you can see it's pretty much the same. Income distribution pretty much the same in Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow. And if you look at mortality rates by all causes in Glasgow relative to Liverpool, this is cancer, this is heart disease, this is lung cancer. These are external causes like suicide, violence, accidents. This is suicide, this is alcohol-related deaths, drug-related deaths. That's Glasgow compared to these other cities. Glasgow's problem, and indeed Scotland's problem, is not deaths, not an increased number of deaths from heart disease and cancer. It's an increased number of deaths from drugs, alcohol, suicide, violence, and accidents, and it occurs in young people. It's teenagers and young working age people who are suffering this sort of problem. And I asked my friend at the time was a director of public health in Liverpool, and I said, but Liverpool, you know, the Toxteth riots and things like that. And she said, well, after the Toxteth riots, Liverpool Council got to grips with the problem. They went in, they changed the houses, they supported the community and so on. Glasgow hasn't done any of that, obviously. So the communities that were problematic in Liverpool have been transformed. And I went down to Toxteth, and it's actually a very nice area now. So they also noticed this kind of phenomenon in America. Angus Deaton, a Scot who works in America, looked at deaths in people in their 50s due to drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And from the late 1990s to quite recently, deaths in white non-Hispanic people in the United States have gone up hugely. And he also looked at where in America saw the highest rise, and it was areas that actually voted for Donald Trump. Hopelessness. And they turned to a complete hooligan to try and get themselves out of that type of hopelessness. So, challenge of inequalities, is it due to societal issues, or is it just due to the choices that people make to drink and take drugs? And what I have concluded when I've looked at this is that most people get it wrong by oversimplifying the problem. Oh, these people they're dying of alcoholic liver disease, therefore they're obviously drinking too much, therefore it's their fault. And therefore we say, okay, let's try and make it difficult for them to buy alcohol. And that doesn't work. They're going to get alcohol regardless. So our approach to these issues is not good. And Joseph Townsend, hunger will tame the fiercest animals, it will teach decency and civility, obedience and subjection. 'Tis only hunger which can spur and goad the poor unto labour. He could be a government minister these days. You know, that's what we've got. It's insane, that kind of thinking. And yet that's the kind of thinking that runs through a lot of what the leading political parties are doing just now. So, what have we seen that's made a difference? And actually, just giving money to poor people makes a difference. There have been a whole range of studies done on giving money, minimum income, giving baseline funding to folk. Okay, people here get benefits and so on. But in America, in a number of places, they actually tried giving them proper salaries. And this is the kind of thing that they achieved. Malnutrition in the community falling, childhood illnesses reduced, school attendance going up, crime down significantly, incomes up by 38%. In Canada, significantly reduced domestic violence, better mental health, hospitalizations down. In New Jersey, high school graduations went up 30%. However, the Americans were planning on making minimum income a thing across the whole of the United States. And then someone came up with this statistic that in Seattle, divorces increased by 50%. So they said, oh no, we can't possibly do this now. It was a lie. Divorces in Seattle did not increase, but the people who wanted to stop the whole idea, the right-wingers, and I have to admit, I'm not a member of any political party, a plague on all their houses as far as I'm concerned, but the right-wingers didn't want minimum income going out there, and they came up with a lie to stop it happening. Disgusting. The Broadway experiment in London looked at 13 rough sleepers. Between them, they'd been sleeping in a range of 4 to 45 years. Imagine 45 years rough sleeping. Incredible that the guy survived that long. They put 13 bank accounts out with £3,000 each. They gave the individuals personalised support, a mentor, someone to help them find their way through the system. And they asked them, what is it you need? We're not here to tell you, but we're here to help you. The first person they asked for spectacles. Well, I like to read the papers that folk throw away, but I've broke my specs. Can you get me a pair of specs? The most expensive thing anyone asked for was this guy who said, well, when I was a wee boy, my parents used to take me to Dorset, to a caravan park, and we had great holidays there. Can you see if there's a vacant caravan there that I could buy with the £3,000 and I'll go and live in it? Building that sense of trust, that sense of self-esteem in the individuals led to 11 of the 13, within about 6 months, 11 of the 13 were in permanent accommodation. 3 of them got jobs. The average spend out the bank accounts was £800. The Economist looked at the thing and said, the most efficient way to spend money on the homeless might be just to give it to them. But the critical thing was they didn't just get money, they got the mentor. They got someone to help them find their way. And I've spent a lot of time in prison. Most of the time they let me out. But you go in and you go into the Young Offenders Institution and ask them what they're going to do when they get out, and the answer is always the same. I'll never get a job. So what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. And what they never say is, and the girlfriend will have a baby, and the baby will be born into this chaotic household. The successful individuals, I mean, I always use this line, one of my best friends was an attempted murderer. This was a guy who spent a long time in jail with, as a young man, attempted murder. He'd had a terribly chaotic childhood, sleeping out as a young teenager, sleeping in stairwells and all that kind of thing. And he got himself a gun to protect himself, and that didn't go well. And he now works for the police in the violence reduction unit. And what made a difference to him was a prison officer would come in, sit beside him on his bed every day, put his arm around him and say, you're a clever guy. You're better than this. You can do good things. And he does good things. I see him around town and he's got a group of 3 or 4 young guys and he's helping to get them. It's that community. I've been where you are, but you don't need to spend the rest of your life in this chaotic place. Beacon and Old Hill Estate in Falmouth. All the men in this estate worked in the Naval Dockyard in Falmouth until it closed down in the 1960s, and it became a war zone. Literally, the police withdrew because they couldn't cope with the violence and so on. 2 health visitors transformed the place, and they decided that they had to take control of the place after a particularly horrible incident in which a young girl's pet rabbits were thrown in a bonfire and all this kind of thing. And they left 50 letters through 50 doors. These people, we know these people, they'll help us. So they called a meeting of local people. 5 people turned up, and they started a program which over the next 8 years produced those outcomes. And I met one of those health visitors. King Charles, or Prince Charles as he was then, bought a house down in Ayrshire, Dumfries House, and he invited this lady up, and he invited me down to meet her. And she was a lovely health visitor who just said, we've got to make a difference. And what they did was, they asked these 5 people, what do we need to change? Well, the place looks horrible. The gardens were overgrown, they hadn't been painted, the local authority just turned their backs on them. Let's make it look better. So the health visitors got money for gardening stuff, and they started improving the look of the place. And she told me that on one front garden that they started working on, it was so overgrown, they had to hack away trees and bushes and so on in this front garden. And they suddenly realised there was a long-forgotten Ford Transit van parked on the grass. Nobody had forgotten all about it. And she showed me pictures of the place, and it looked absolutely jaw-dropping, because they all wanted their houses painted in different colours: purple, red, yellow, black, all this kind of thing. But it was their choice, and they made a difference. And the local chief constable gave the community a public apology, saying, we couldn't handle you. We turned our backs on you. And now unemployment down, postnatal depression down, crime down, child protection down, teenage pregnancies down. The community took control and built itself up and made themselves feel good about it. Oops, what's happened there? Oh, sorry, pressed the wrong button. So, the connectivity in all of this, I really got to appreciate when I went to New York to see the scientists doing this experiment, where the experiment was all about how they let mother monkey feed the baby monkeys. This is not a happy baby monkey, depressed. And what happened was, normally the food was lying out in the cage in the zoo. Mum could reach down, get the food, give it to baby when he indicated he was hungry. In another part of the animal house, they took the food away and they hid it. So when baby monkey indicated he was hungry, Mum had to go and find the baby monkey, find the food, and she would be away from the monkey for a long time. And you would think that that's the one that would upset the baby monkey. Well, you'd be wrong. What upset the baby monkey wasn't Mum being there or Mum not being there. These are stress hormone levels in the baby monkeys. These are stress hormone levels where Mum found it easy to feed the babies. These are stress hormone levels where Mum had to go away and find the food. And these are the stress hormone levels in the babies where they randomly changed the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It wasn't Mum being there or Mum not being there. It was baby not knowing what was going on. Is she here today or is she not here today? And that's what made the baby monkeys depressed. And not only that, those elevated stress hormone levels changed the way the monkeys' brains developed. And that's what happened here. We came back from there. We looked at brain structure. We did complicated imaging in volunteer young men in affluent deprived areas in Glasgow, and we found their brain structure had changed if they lived in chaotic households. So the importance of being able to make positive choices and get good outcomes are all dependent on the circumstances in which we live. And if parents live in a chaotic community, they're the ones that are going to cause problems for their kids. And therefore, supporting communities to thrive, to look good, to allow their residents to feel good about themselves is absolutely critical. So, I started off as a doctor looking at all these outcomes, and these outcomes I thought at that time, like most people, were commoner in poor folk. And it was all because of their behaviours. It's all because of what they did. But in fact, it was their ability to choose, make choices, that was the problem. And that is because they didn't have a sense of purpose, they didn't have a sense of control, they didn't have any self-esteem because they lived in horrible environments, and they didn't have a supportive network of people. So they didn't have well-being. And if you look at the other social outcomes that you see associated with them, then these are the behaviours that emerge in those abnormal brain structures. And you can see that that's their ability to choose. And indeed, poorer people were more likely to die of COVID, and that's because they had these elevated stress hormone levels, and that produced this cytokine storm thing that we saw in COVID. So, if we want to make communities better, we need to understand what's going on in the community. We need the data. We need to know which houses are chaotic. District nurses went to Bridgeton Health Centre, got them to write down the names of 20 or 30 families they were worried about, took those names up to the A&E department at the Royal Infirmary, and they said, yeah, we know all those families. Spoke to the community policeman, he said, yeah, oh, they all die on 999 regularly. Spoke to the housing folk, oh yeah, their doors get kicked in. You guys, frontline staff, know what's happening out there. But do we use that knowledge? No, because we expect top-down action. Bottom-up action is what's going to make a difference. Frontline staff do the what matters to you thing and support citizens to solve their problems and make them feel good about themselves and their capacity to be in charge of things, and then keep looking at the difference you're making. What happens is, at the moment, what we've got are organisations that want to keep power, health boards, local authorities, etc. Performance management, we'll do things and we'll get credit for making folk do these things. Quality improvement, Jason Leach and I started some of this with the Early Years Collaborative, where we were trying to share power with district nurses and so on, but actually mobilising social action is the key here. Co-producing better outcomes with the residents living in these homes themselves, working with them to help. Jimmy Reid, I was a medical student in '71 when Jimmy Reid was elected Lord Rector of Glasgow University, and I remember vividly his speech. What he talked about was alienation, the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision-making, feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people, feel with justification they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. He nailed it. That speech was reprinted in full in the New York Times, which called it the single most important speech since the Gettysburg Address made by Abraham Lincoln. And they were absolutely right. He knew frustration just turned to drink and drugs. So we cause wellness by giving people an optimistic outlook and a sense of control, make them feel they have a sense of purpose in life, help them to deal with their problems, and produce a supportive network of people for them. You can do this. Let me help you. That's what makes the difference. This is a study looked at sense of control in a number of different countries after the fall of the Soviet Union. A guy from London went round these different countries and measured sense of control in the residents and looked at their standardized death rate. Russian citizens had the lowest sense of control, the highest death rate. Poles and Czechs and Hungarians, highest sense of control, lowest death rate. It works. Give people a sense that they're in charge of their futures. Sense of hopelessness. An American lady went to Finland and measured hopelessness and other risk factors for heart disease in the male population. Highly hopeless men were significantly more likely to die of heart disease and cancer than men with lower levels of hopeless, because she knew that all men are hopeless to a greater or lesser extent, you know, high or low. But highly hopeless men have worse outcomes. Hopelessness, that sense of not being in charge or hopeless. The brain structures that changes, I won't go into this in any great detail just now, but we measured amygdala, hippocampus and prefrontal cortex in young men in Glasgow, and we found that these were significantly abnormal. Adverse childhood events study, different types of abuse. The more of these events in a child's life, the more likely he or she is to have adverse outcomes, like a child with significant levels of adverse events, significantly more likely to perpetrate violence in their own communities. South Island of New Zealand, a cohort of children identified 50 years ago as adults, those who were identified as having abnormal emotional behaviour, negativity, poor attentiveness at school, significantly more likely to be unemployed, criminal convictions, experience teenage pregnancy, be substance misusers, and have metabolic syndrome. If you fix this, it saves a shed load of money. The last major politician I spoke to said this would be very expensive. You save tons of money. I've calculated across Scotland, if you did away with adverse childhood experiences, it would save the country £5.9 billion a year. But this was a study done in north of England where they introduced this approach of allowing communities to do their own things. And social services costs fell from £83,000 to £824 in this deprived community. Local authority spend fixing kicked-in doors and so on fell. Health service costs fell. Police costs fell from £3,800 to £33. Education was the only one that saw increasing costs because more kids were going to school. So it saves money. And this is a guy, it's a Catholic priest who went to a parish in Los Angeles that was absolutely populated by Latino gangs. And he comes across to Glasgow quite often at our invitation to talk about what he did. He arrived, and he says, I arrived and I went and put my suitcase in the parish house, and then I thought I'd go and walk down the road and see what the place looked like. And I got about 100 yards down the road and a police car stopped me. He said, Father, if you carry on walking down here, you'll be dead in half an hour. The Latino gangs don't deal with people like you. He said, that's what I'm here for. And he carried on. And you can see here, 20 years further on, he reckons he has transformed the lives of about 3,000 to 4,000 families, because he asked them, what did they need? Well, they said, well, we do drink and drugs and fighting because there's no jobs. So he got this chap, a friend of his, who's a film producer, to buy a disused bakery, and he created homeboy bakeries. And he talks, when he comes to Glasgow, talks to the kids. What we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than stands in judgment at how they carry them. Compassion. Understand why people are doing what they're doing and fix it. I'll just finish with this. Confucius, I came across this quote recently. We indicate to rulers after us that rather than punish the country's deviants, consider the poverty of the multitudes and relieve their misery, and then criminals will disappear. The reason why ordinary people act badly comes from the widespread inability to survive day to day. There is no source of criminality in the country but waste of natural resources. There is a reason why the ignorant underclasses are not honest. It is because the rulers who should be honest are not. On that point, I will leave it and happy to take questions.